The laughter came first. It filled the room like smoke, thick, confident, and impossible to ignore. It bounced off the crystal glasses and the gold-framed portraits on the walls. It silenced the soft clink of silverware and made every guest freeze with their forks halfway to their mouths. Richard Hale was laughing at his son's fiancée, and he wasn't trying to hide it. Daniel. Richard set down his wine glass slowly, like a man who had all the time in the world. He dabbed the corner of his mouth with a white cloth napkin and looked down the long dinner table at his son. Please tell me this is a joke. Daniel Hale sat rigid in his chair. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the table. Dad. She's dumb. Son. Richard said the way you'd say it's raining outside, calm, certain, like it wasn't even worth arguing. I don't know how else to say it. She's a sweet girl, I'm sure, but she has no idea what she's walked into. The room went very still. 14 people sat around that table. Distant cousins with quiet ambitions. Business partners with careful smiles. 2 aunts who never missed a family scandal. They all looked down at their plates now, not out of shame, but out of a particular kind of cowardice that comes from having too much to lose. Maya Green sat at the far end of the table. She didn't flinch. She was 28 years old, with steady brown eyes and hands that stayed completely still in her lap. She wore a simple dark green dress that cost less than the napkins on the table, and she had arrived that evening with a black bag over her shoulder that Daniel had tried to carry for her. She had smiled and told him she'd keep it close. Now she understood why she had said that. She looked at Richard Hale, this man with his silver hair, his tailored jacket, his absolute certainty, and she felt something move through her. Not anger, not shame, something quieter than both, something that had been building for a very long time. Dad, that's enough. Daniel's voice was low and tight, like a wire about to snap. I haven't even started, son. Richard leaned back in his chair and opened his hands like a man presenting a gift. She works at a small consultancy firm. She rents an apartment on the east side. She has no family connections, no financial standing, and no understanding of what this family actually does. He glanced at Maya now, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. It's not personal, my dear. It's simply logic. One of the aunts cleared her throat. A business partner reached for his water glass. Daniel pushed his chair back. I swear. Daniel. Maya's voice was soft, quiet enough that he stopped moving. She looked at him and gave a small shake of her head. Just barely. Just enough. He looked at her face. He saw something there, a steadiness that didn't match the moment, a calm that felt almost too prepared, and slowly, without fully understanding why, he sat back down. Richard watched this little exchange with the patience of someone who had already won. You see, he continued, now speaking to the table more than anyone in particular, I've spent 40 years building what this family has. Every alliance, every investment, every decision has been deliberate, careful, and now my son wants to bring someone into the center of all that, someone who doesn't even understand the perimeter of it. He picked up his wine glass again. It's not cruelty. It's responsibility. She understands more than you think. Daniel's voice came out rough. Does she? Richard's eyes moved to Maya. There was a challenge in them, but also something else, the kind of look that expects silence, that has been answered with silence so many times it has forgotten any other response is possible. Then let her speak. Every face at the table turned toward Maya. She let the moment breathe. She looked at the candles burning in the center of the table. She looked at the portraits above Richard's head. 4 generations of Hale men staring down with the same expression as the man sitting beneath them. She looked at Daniel, whose eyes were asking her something she already knew the answer to. Then she looked at Richard Hale, and she smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a polite smile. The kind of smile that belongs to someone who knows exactly where they are and exactly what comes next. She reached down beside her chair. She lifted the black bag onto her lap, and from inside it, she pulled out a folder. It was thick, maybe 2 inches of printed pages, organized with tabs, held together with a black clip. She set it on the table in front of her with a soft, flat sound that somehow carried to every corner of the room. She did not open it. She did not explain it. She just rested her hand on top of it and looked at Richard Hale the way you look at someone when you are no longer afraid of them. The laughter was gone now. One of the business partners leaned forward without meaning to. An aunt tilted her head. Daniel stared at the folder with wide eyes because he had never seen it before. He had never known it existed. Richard Hale looked at the folder on his table. Then he looked at the young woman he had just called dumb in front of 14 people. Something moved across his face. It was small. It was fast. But it was there. For the first time all evening, Richard Hale was not sure what came next. And in the thick, golden silence of that candlelit room, with 14 people holding their breath in crystal glasses, catching the light, and 4 generations of Hale men watching from their frames on the wall, Maya Green opened the folder. The first page was a number. Just one number, printed in large bold type at the top of the page. Maya turned around slowly and slid it down the center of the table, so that Richard Hale could read it from where he sat. He looked at it. His expression did not change, but his hand, the one holding the wine glass, lowered itself back to the table a little too carefully. That, Maya said, her voice clear and unhurried, is the projected loss your company will absorb in the next 90 days. Not because of the market, not because of bad timing. She paused. Because someone you trust has been moving money in a direction you never approved. Nobody laughed now. The room had transformed into something else entirely. The warmth of the candles felt different, less elegant, more exposing, like a light held up to something that preferred darkness. Guests who had been looking at their plates were now looking at Maya. Guests who had been looking at Maya were now looking at Richard. Richard Hale set down his wine glass. That's a serious accusation, he said. His voice was controlled, but something underneath it had shifted, the way a floor shifts before it cracks. It isn't an accusation, Maya said simply. It's a document. She turned to the next tab in the folder and pulled out 3 pages, each one dense with numbers, dates, and names. She laid them side by side on the table in front of her, smooth and deliberate, like a teacher setting out a lesson she had prepared a long time ago. 18 months ago, she began, I took a position at Crest Advisory Group. Most people in this room probably know it as a mid-sized consultancy. What most people don't know is that Crest holds a quiet operational contract with Hale Global's Eastern Division. She let that settle. I didn't take that job by accident. Daniel stared at her. Maya, let her finish. The voice came from the far end of the table. It was one of the business partners, a woman named Claire, who had said almost nothing all evening. Her eyes were fixed on the folder with an expression that was no longer polite or distant. It was alert, the kind of alert that belongs to someone who has just heard a word they recognize from a nightmare. Maya gave Claire a brief look, then continued. Inside Crest, I had access to shared data that connected back to Hale Global's transaction records. Not all of them, but enough. She turned to another tab. I started noticing patterns. Small transfers, never large enough to trigger automatic flags, moving from 3 subsidiary accounts into a holding structure that doesn't appear on any official filing I could find. She tapped the page. These transfers happen on the same day every month for 14 months, always after a board meeting, always signed off by the same internal authority code. The room was so quiet now that the candles could be heard. Tiny, soft sound of flame and melting wax. Richard Hale's face had become unreadable. The performance of certainty he had worn all evening was still technically in place, but it had gone rigid, the way a mask goes rigid when the face beneath it is doing something the mask wasn't built to cover. Whose authority code? He asked. Maya looked up from the folder. She looked past Richard, toward the entrance of the dining room, and as if the evening had been scripted, as if truth had its own sense of timing, the doors opened. Victor Mensa walked in. He was 60 years old, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed, with the comfortable ease of a man who had spent decades being welcomed into rooms. He had been Richard Hale's closest partner for 22 years. He had danced at Daniel's graduation party. There was a photograph of him and Richard on the wall of Richard's office, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at something no one else remembered. He stopped when he saw the folder on the table. His eyes moved from the folder to Maya. His smile arrived, Practice, warm, just slightly delayed. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said smoothly. Traffic was impossible. He moved toward his usual seat at the table. "What did I miss?" Nobody answered him. The silence was its own kind of answer. Victor looked at Richard. Richard was looking at Maya. Maya was looking at Victor with the same steady calm she had worn all evening, and Victor's smile, for just a fraction of a second, flickered. "Victor," Maya said, "I was just explaining the 14-month transfer pattern, the one tied to your internal authority code." She tilted her head slightly. "Would you like to sit down?" Something happened to Victor's face then. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes, a micro-adjustment in the set of his jaw. To most people in the room, it probably looked like confusion. But Daniel was watching very carefully, and what he saw in Victor's face in that moment was not confusion at all. It was calculation. Victor laughed, a short, easy sound. "I have no idea what she's talking about, Richard. I think your son's girlfriend may have." "Fiancé," Daniel said. The word came out quiet and final, like a door closing. Victor glanced at him. "Of course. I only meant—" "The holding structure," Maya continued, as if Victor had not spoken, "is registered under a shell company incorporated in a jurisdiction that Hale Global has no formal relationship with, but Crest Advisory does." She pulled another page from the folder. "This is the incorporation document. This is a signatory." She placed it on the table and turned it so the room could see. "And this is a record of 4 private meetings that took place in this house. This house, between the shell company's representative and someone with full access to Hale Global's internal systems." The page sat on the table like a stone dropped into still water. Richard Hale stood up. It was not a dramatic movement. He simply rose from his chair slowly, the way very powerful people rise when their power has just been quietly, completely rearranged. He looked at Victor. He looked for a long time. Victor's smile was gone. "Richard, listen to me." Victor's voice was still controlled, but the warmth had left it entirely. What remained was something harder and more careful. "This girl has taken partial data and built a story around it. You know how these things work. You know that numbers without context—" "The context is on page 11, Maya said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The private meeting dates align with the 4 quarters in which Hale Global's Eastern Division reported unexpected losses. Not catastrophic ones, small enough to explain away, but consistent, precisely consistent. She looked at Victor. Losses don't repeat like clockwork unless someone is keeping clock. The room breathed. Claire, the business partner at the far end of the table, pushed back her chair and picked up her phone. One of the cousins had gone pale. An aunt reached across the table and gripped her sister's hand without looking at her. Daniel was looking at Maya. He was seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time in a way he couldn't fully explain. He had loved her for 2 years. He had held her hand through hard days and laughed with her on ordinary evenings. But this woman sitting at the end of his father's table, calm as water and precise as mathematics, dismantling a 22-year betrayal with the quiet confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment long before anyone knew a moment was coming. He didn't have words for what he felt. Richard Hale turned away from Victor. He looked at Maya, and for the first time since she had walked through his front door that evening, Richard Hale looked at her not as an inconvenience, not as an error in his son's judgment, but as something his 40 years of careful building had somehow failed to prepare him to recognize. A person who knew more than he did. "Keep going," he said quietly. Maya turned to the final tab in the folder. "There's one more thing," she said. "And this part," she paused. Her composure held, but something behind her eyes shifted just slightly, like a light adjusting. "This part is harder to explain with numbers." The final tab held fewer pages than the others. Just 4 sheets, worn at the edges, as though they had been handled many times. Taken out, read, put back, taken out again. Maya looked at them for a moment before she spoke, and in that pause the room felt something shift. The energy that had been sharp and electric softened into something more tender, more fragile, like the last few minutes before dawn when the darkness finally admits it is losing. 12 years ago, Maya began, my father's business collapsed. Her voice was the same, steady, clear, but something underneath it was different now. Something human and unhidden. He had built it over 20 years. A small import company. Nothing like what's in this room, but everything to us. She looked down at the pages briefly, then back up. When it fell, it didn't fall slowly. It fell all at once. Overnight, almost, we lost a business. We lost a house. My mother got sick that same year, the kind of sick that cost money we no longer had. She paused. I was 16. Nobody moved. There was a scholarship program. A private one, not widely advertised. It was connected to a foundation that helped children of collapsed small businesses access secondary and university education. She slid one of the worn pages to the center of the table. This is the approval letter I received. I read it so many times the paper thinned at the folds. Daniel leaned forward. He looked at the letter. Then he looked at the letterhead at the top of the page. Hale Family Foundation. His breath left him slowly. I didn't know whose foundation it was when I received it, Maya said. I was 16 and desperate and grateful in a way that you're only grateful when something arrives at the exact moment you were about to stop hoping. She looked at Richard now, directly and without performance. I found out years later. By then I was in university, studying finance, building something from the ground up, and I made a decision. She folded her hands on the table. If I ever had the chance to protect this family, I would take it, not because I owed a debt, but because kindness given without expectation deserves to be honored the same way. Richard Hale sat very still. The arrogance that had filled his face at the beginning of the evening was completely gone. In its place was something rawer and more complicated. The expression of a man who was being shown a mirror he didn't know existed, reflecting a version of himself that is better than the version he has been performing. You knew about Victor, Daniel said softly, not as an accusation. More like a man slowly understanding the shape of something enormous. How long? 7 months, Maya said. I found the first thread at Crest. It took me 4 more months to pull enough of it together to be certain. And then, she stopped. Something moved across her face. And then your father invited me to dinner and told me in front of everyone that I was dumb. A sound came from somewhere at the table. It might have been a laugh, surprised and uncomfortable. It might have been something else. I had 2 choices, Maya continued. I could have walked out. Honestly, part of me wanted to. She glanced at Daniel, and something warm passed between them, private and unguarded. But the other part of me remembered a 16-year-old girl reading a letter at a kitchen table in an empty house, and I thought, no, not yet, not until this is finished. Victor had not sat down since he arrived. He was still standing near the entrance of the dining room, and the confident ease he had carried in with him had fully dissolved. What remained was a man calculating odds in real time, looking for an exit in an argument that had no exits. This is circumstantial, he said. His voice had lost its warmth entirely now. It was bare and functional, like a tool being used past its purpose. You can't prove intent. You have patterns and dates and... Page 3, Maya said. The third document in the second tab. She didn't look at him. She spoke to the table. There's a recorded phone call, made from a number registered to the shell company's representative, received by a mobile device whose billing address is this house. She finally looked at Victor. Your voice is on it, Victor. 14 seconds. Enough. The word enough landed in the room like a final note. Victor's mouth opened. Then it closed. The calculation in his eyes flickered once more, looking for something, an angle, an ally, a version of this moment where he still walked out intact. And then, slowly, it stopped. The looking stopped. His shoulders dropped by a fraction of an inch, barely visible, but the people watching closely saw it. It was the drop of a man who has just put down something very heavy and very wrong. Richard moved first. He walked around the long table, past the guests who parted for him without being asked, past the candlelight, past the portraits of 4 generations of Hale men, and he stopped in front of Victor. They stood close, the way old friends stand, close enough to remember everything. 22 years, Richard said. His voice was barely above a whisper. Victor said nothing. Get out of my house. It was quiet. No rage, no theater. Just 4 words carrying the full weight of betrayal that had taken 14 months to build and 14 seconds of recorded audio to end. Victor looked at Richard for one long moment, and then he walked out. His footsteps crossed the marble hallway, and then the front door opened, and then it closed, and then there was only the sound of the candles again. The room exhaled. Claire, the business partner, was already on her phone, speaking in a low and urgent voice. 2 of the cousins were talking quietly. One of the aunts was crying the way that older women cry at family events, silently, with great dignity, dabbing her eyes with a folded napkin. Daniel stood up from his chair. He walked to the end of the table, to where Maya sat with her hand still folded over the closed folder, and he stood in front of her for a moment. He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Then he crouched down beside her chair, so that his eyes were level with hers. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. His voice was gentle, not wounded. "Because you would have tried to protect me," she said. "And I needed to protect you first." He looked at her for a long time. Then he took her hand in both of his, and he held it the way you hold something you almost lost without knowing it was in danger. Behind them, Richard Hale stood at the head of his long table, surrounded by the glittering and the gilded. In the room he had ruled for decades with the certainty of a man who believed money made you wise. He looked at the worn letter on the table, the one his foundation had sent to a 16-year-old girl in an empty house, the one he had never known about, the one that had traveled 12 years through hardship and study and quiet. Determination to arrive back at his table on this exact evening. He picked it up carefully. He read it, and Richard Hale, billionaire patriarch, the man who had laughed at the beginning of this evening with absolute confidence, sat down in his chair and pressed the letter flat against his chest, and his eyes filled with tears. Not for the betrayal, not for the money, for the thing he had almost missed entirely, the thing that had been sitting at the end of his table all along, dressed in a simple green dress with a black bag over her shoulder, waiting patiently for him to be ready to see it. Dignity, loyalty, the kind that isn't bought or inherited, the kind that is built quietly in the hardest years by people the world forgot to watch. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, Maya stood at the window of the Hale family home and looked out at the city lights spread below. Daniel stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Richard appeared in the doorway behind them. He didn't say much. He wasn't a man who had learned yet how to say the biggest things. But he crossed the room, and he stood next to Maya, and he looked out at the same city she was looking at. "The scholarship," he said finally. "I sign 100 documents a week." "I didn't," he stopped. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Maya said. "It mattered," he said, "what you received. It mattered to someone." "It mattered to me," she said. "It still does." Richard nodded slowly. Outside, the city glittered and hummed, indifferent and endless. Inside, something old and rigid had cracked open, and in the crack, small and tender and full of particular hope that only arrives after a hard truth, something new had begun to grow. Not a business, not a legacy in the way Richard had always understood the word. Something quieter, something that would last longer. A family, finally learning what it actually meant to be one. If this story moved something in you, if you felt Maya's patience, Daniel's torn heart, or Richard's moment at the window, then you already understand what this story was really about. It was never about money. It was about the quiet courage it takes to protect people who haven't yet earned it, and the grace it takes to accept truth when it arrives wearing a simple green dress. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. We love knowing who's in this room with us. If this touched you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss a story. We'll be back soon with another journey where truth changes destinies.